What's up, guys? Welcome to the next installment of our mini series here. Today we are talking about the Indianapolis Colts. They are led by new sheriff in town, Philip Rivers. He comes over from the LA Chargers, San Diego Chargers, whatever you're used to calling them. That's where he's from. I have him projected out for his first year with the Colts for about 4,100 yards, 26 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and 30 rushing yards on the ground. So that's a huge number for him with one touchdown. So about 306 fantasy points. He does have some weapons out there in Indianapolis that we're going to get to positionally, but Doc, what's your thoughts on Philip Rivers this year? And then, actually, before I ask you about that, just behind him, you obviously got Jacoby Brissett, who has started some games in this league. He started all last year, and then they drafted Jacob Eason in the fourth round of this year's draft, the 2020 draft. And then they also got speedster Chad Kelly, who says he's the second fastest quarterback in the league, but he's probably just going to get cut anyway, so we're not even going to talk about him. But obviously, if Philip Rivers goes down, you got some stability behind him. Jacoby Brissett, like I said, he has started some games in this league before. He's probably feeling a little salty that they brought somebody in because that was his team, and now they bring in a 37-year-old quarterback to kind of take over for the next year or two until he retires. But what's your thoughts on the quarterback situation out there in Indianapolis?
So before I start with Philip Rivers, yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of people saying, why are people anointing Jacob Eason as the future Colts quarterback? I mean, we've kind of seen Jacoby Brissett start, and it's not impressive. So for people that are thinking Jacoby Brissett could be the long-term answer there still, I mean, I don't really understand that argument. I like Eason. He's got a big arm. He's kind of the perfect quarterback for Frank Reich's system. When you think about like a Carson Wentz, a guy just with a big arm, I mean, those are the kind of QBs that this offense caters to. So I still think Jacob Eason is the future. I have him in a ton of leagues stashed on my taxi squad. We don't know how long Philip Rivers is going to be there, and I like him as an under-the-radar candidate to be a starting QB in a few years. But if you're looking at this season, Philip Rivers is the guy. And I'm kind of really interested to see where this offense lands. So last year, this was a very run-heavy team. They had the 25th fewest passing attempts. They had the fourth most rushing attempts. So this was a very run-heavy scheme. And then when I look back at Philip Rivers' career, there was one year where he had 661 attempts. That was his career high. Who was his offensive coordinator then? It was Frank Reich. So then things like that get thrown into the mix, and you're like, okay, how do I analyze this offense? This is a team that seems like it's going in a direction where they want to run the ball more. They traded up for Jonathan Taylor. I still believe that's the direction they're going in, but I want to throw out there, that's not guaranteed because Frank Reich was very pass heavy, and I didn't dive into it deeply. There could have been other factors. I don't know how their defense was that season, but I just thought that was interesting that in Philip Rivers' really long and successful career, Frank Reich was his offensive coordinator when he had the most pass attempts in his career. So I personally am not a big Philip Rivers fan. I think there's a lot of young guys with more upside, and if you're looking at today's game in terms of fantasy quarterbacks, a lot of these guys run the ball. 30 rushing yards isn't getting it done for me for fantasy purposes, and right off the bat that kind of limits his upside. And when you look at it, he's been known as a gunslinger, but he's kind of starting to get wild and out of control. He was number 2 in terms of interceptable passes thrown last year. He had 36 total that should have been intercepted. He only threw 20, so that means 16 passes were dropped by DBs and other defenders. So he was actually really close to Jameis. I mean, that's how bad that he was. He's kind of getting wild and out of control at this point in his career, which obviously doesn't help you for fantasy purposes. And couple that with, I still think this is going to be a pass-heavy or a run-heavy scheme. I'm not overly high on Philip Rivers.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because if it wasn't for Jameis's 30 interceptions that he threw, I think we would be talking about Philip Rivers turning the ball over a lot more. But Jameis kind of took that trophy home. And no love for Chad Kelly, huh? I can't believe it. Next up, we got our running backs. We got a running back room, as you already started to talk about them. They did trade up for Jonathan Taylor, but they still have Marlon Mack there. They got Nyheim Hines there. Jordan Wilkins is still on the depth chart. we did our running back show and we talked about Jonathan Taylor. He came in on one of our rankings shows that we did. We kind of talked about like how we really don't like to bring it up too much, but how COVID might affect the running back room there. Now, if this was just a regular off season, we could see one of these guys on their way out. We could see a Marlon Mack trade, or we could see a Naeem Hines be cut because they need to get down to 53 guys. But with it being a kind of a wonky off season, and we don't even know. I mean, how many players are allowing to be on the final roster now? They might extend it, they might not. They might still have to get down to 53. Who knows what's going to go on there? We're probably looking at a combination of all these guys being there and dipping into each other's workloads. And we know Marlon Mack can carry a load. We know Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin can carry a load. So it's really hard to pinpoint how this fantasy season is going to work out for them. Jonathan Taylor, long term, is obviously the guy for dynasty leagues. If you're in the top 3 picks in your rookie draft, you're taking Jonathan Taylor. If you're in a dynasty league, you're taking Jonathan Taylor early. But if you're in a redraft league, it's kind of tough to say where you want to take him. And he is being ranked higher than Marlon Mack. But I mean, Marlon Mack is probably going to get the early season work, and then depending on how that goes, they might keep him flowing all year. If he does start to kind of wear down a little bit or flame out a little bit, Jonathan Taylor could come in as he gets more acclimated with the offense. But you're paying a high price to get him. So are you willing to risk that chance in August, September, so you can have a good running back in November, December? That's really the question there.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. In redraft leagues, that Jonathan Taylor's a huge risk. I already mentioned, just kind of briefly going over their offense, that they did have the fourth most rushing attempts last year, and I think that's the direction that they're going. But in general, I don't understand really why people are writing Marlon Mack off so quickly. He's 24 years old. He was 22nd in fantasy points per game last year. This is a great offensive line, and we'll touch on that in a moment too. But I mean, this is a all-around great situation for Marlon Mack. Now I get it. Jonathan Taylor has all the talent in the world. He is by far and away way more talented than Marlon Mack, but I just can't see Marlon Mack not being involved in some capacity. And I'm not saying it's going to be 50-50. It might be 60% Jonathan Taylor, 30% Marlon Mack, 10% Naheem, whatever that split is. It's still going to take some touches away from Jonathan Taylor. And I think in the beginning of the year especially, you're going to see it tilt more towards Marlon Mack's favor. But Marlon Mack's going as the 37th running back overall in leagues right now. I mean, I like that value right now. I mean, you're talking at that point, the way that I draft, he'd probably be my 5th running back. I'll take that chance. Even if it's a really strong first half, I'll take it. And, if you have Jonathan Taylor and you make it halfway through the season with success, congratulations. You may then reap the benefits for the last 5 weeks of the season. But, yeah, I mean, if you're going strictly off value, I like Marlon Mack's better. If I had to pick one guy that was going to get cut from this roster, or not cut, I mean, Marlon Mack would be the guy I think would get traded right now. Because when you look, they do actually have a little bit of depth. They could slide Jonathan Taylor in as their bell cow. Naheem Hines is a very solid pass catching back. And then they have Jordan Wilkins still on the roster, who, just a year and a half ago, a lot of people thought he was going to be the future of the Colts backfield. So not that I love Jordan Wilkins, but he is great. I mean, he's their 4th running back right now. That's great running back depth. So, I mean, they can kind of afford to trade Marlon Mack and pick up an extra pick. Another guy we haven't talked about, and I'll talk about him just quickly, is Naheem Hines. He's going as a 67th running back off the board right now, and there's been some public comments where the coaching staff says they want to get Naheem Hines heavily involved in the passing game. I don't read much into coach speak, but I'll take the chances. If he's a 67th running back off the board, if he's one of my last 2 picks, I'll take that chance in a PPR league. Mm-hmm. He's a guy that might sneakily get you 60 receptions and might be a strong flex play when you have guys on a bye. So I like Naheem Hines' value. Love Marlon Mack's value, and right now I don't love Jonathan Taylor's value, but he's a high buy in dynasty leagues.
Yeah, I mean we're probably gonna be talking about him as a top 5, top 6 pick in a couple of years, but right now in redraft it's just not there yet. Like always with these episodes, we do want to bring up the offensive line, and if there's an offensive line to put a lot of stock into, it's the Indianapolis Colts offensive line. They're going to keep Phillip Rivers upright. They're going to open up lanes for Marlon Mack and Jonathan Taylor. The whole left side of the line is first rounders. with their left tackle Anthony Costanzo, their left guard Quentin Nelson, who is one of the best guards to come out in recent years. He was their first round pick in 2018, and then their center Ryan Kelly. And then, with the exception of their right guard, four of their five guys on that offensive line are top two picks. Braden Smith is their right tackle from the second round in 2018. So that line is stacked with talent. They have, when we get into tight ends too, we'll talk about it. But Jack Doyle is a good blocker too. So it's basically like having six offensive linemen out there when he's out there. But this line could open up holes for me and you, Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, Pro Football Focus had them rated as the third best offensive line, and based on their projections, has them as number one this season.
All right. Anything you want to say about them besides that, or go right into wide receivers?
Let's go. Keep rolling.
Keep rolling. All right. So next up is their wide receivers. Who is Phil Rivers throwing the ball to? They got T.Y. Hilton there. He's still there. He's still their number one. They drafted Michael Pittman in the second round this year. So he was their other second round pick that they got with Jonathan Taylor. They drafted Jonathan Taylor in the second round, then they took Michael Pittman. Excuse me. And then they last year in the second round they took Paris Campbell, who is he's due for a breakout year. So they got a trio of pass catchers there for Philip Rivers. The only other name I'd really bring up here, probably just looking at their depth chart, but somebody that could make a little bit of noise, maybe if some injury happens, or it's because he's seen some time last year, is Zach Pascal. Other than that, a lot of these guys are probably not making the roster. Long term, probably not the answer there either. I mean, Desmond Patman was their sixth round pick in this year's draft. He could fight for a roster spot. He could make it as a fifth guy, but when you're talking about fifth and sixth guys on the depth chart, you're really not getting any fancy value from them. But Pittman is probably my favorite. I know he's your favorite. I've never really been a fan of T.Y. Hilton. I mean, he gets the work done. I just always find better value right around where he gets drafted, so I go that other route. But Pittman is a guy that I would take a lot of chance on. I personally, I'm a big receiver type guy. I'm a young receiver type guy. I love Justin Jefferson, love Michael Pittman. Probably going to be grabbing some Jerry Jeudy, second year guys too. Love them. So Pittman is at the top of my list as far as this core goes.
Yeah, so starting off with T.Y. Hilton. I mean, I love T.Y. Hilton in his prime. I think we're a little past that, though. He's struggled with injuries last season and the season before. When you look at medical reports, he has the third highest injury probability right now among all wideouts in the NFL. So long term, that is a concern for him. I think he's being a little overdrafted right now. And I think primarily because Philip Rivers is there, but he's coming off the board as like the 23rd wide receiver right now. That's just too high for me. I don't have confidence that he's going to be a surefire wide receiver too. There's guys with more upside that I like. And even when you look at when he was healthy last season, during that stretch, he had the 34th most points per game while he was on the field. And I think that's reasonable. If you wanted to talk about him as your wide receiver 3, you took him as the 35th, 36th wide receiver off the board. I think that's much more reasonable. So I don't really love his value right now. And in terms of Michael Pittman next, I mean, my love's pretty documented on him. I had an article come out about him, and I think he can have a really successful rookie season. And I really believe from year one, maybe he's not going to be a guy that has 1,000 yards in year one, but I do think that he could be their primary red zone threat. When you look at T.Y. Hilton, he's not a guy that you're overly scared of facing in the red zone. Jack Doyle's there. He's a guy that's usually gets 5 or 6 touchdowns, but Michael Pittman is a big-bodied guy, and I think that he could score 8 touchdowns easily in his rookie season. I mean, you have Philip Rivers there who has targeted big-body receivers throughout his whole career. When you think about guys like, I remember even Michael Floyd in the earlier 2000s, Tyrell Williams, and we've seen him go to the Raiders and do nothing. Mike Williams recently, then his tight ends as well with Antonio Gates, Ladarius Green. I mean, we've seen a lot of examples of it throughout the course of his career, and he seems to favor those type of receivers. So Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting. A lot of the comparisons that people have for Michael Pittman is Dwayne Bowe. And at first you say, oh man, Dwayne Bowe. But Dwayne Bowe had a really nice career in Kansas City. He had over 7,000 yards, 44 touchdowns, and he was a big time red zone threat for the Chiefs. So if that's where he ends up landing, I don't think that's a bad comparison. And in year one, I think he's going to have a lot of relevance scoring touchdowns. Only other guy you mentioned, Zach Pascal. Yeah, I mean, he's more of a possession receiver. I remember I started him in desperation a few times last year. I'm in a league where we start 5 wide receivers, which is kind of insane. So I ended up starting him a few games. He's a possession guy. Maybe if he has a chance to start, he has some streaming consideration, but I'm not drafting him. Paris Campbell is a very interesting name. He's going to be their slot guy. Michael Pittman and T.Y. Hilton are going to start on the outside. That's why I love Michael Pittman, too. I mean, he has one of the best opportunities in year one as well. You talked about Justin Jefferson. I would argue Pittman and Jefferson have the two best opportunities in year one. I talked about T.Y. Hilton's injury concerns. T.Y. Hilton goes down. Michael Pittman's the number one guy. So I love him even more for that reason. But Paris Campbell, very speedy guy. I'm interested to see how they use him. I'm not quite as high on him as other people because I think they're going to use Naheem Hines in the slot a little bit. And I've read a few reports and coaches talking about moving Hines out to the slot and moving him all around the field, kind of like Austin Eckler. And I don't think he's in for an Austin Eckler kind of season, but I think Naheem Hines is actually going to line up in the slot quite a bit. So I like Paris Campbell. He's going as like the 70th wide receiver off the board. So if you're in a deep enough league, I mean, he's the kind of guy, he could see 80, 90 targets, which is great value for that point in a draft. But I guess overall, to sum it up, T.Y. Hilton, don't love his value. Michael Pittman, another point to make. He's going as like the 55th wide receiver off the board. People are starting to take kickers in that range. So if you say kicker or Michael Pittman, it's Michael Pittman.
Yep. And speaking of Naheem Hines, before we get to the tight ends, he has returned kicks and punts. He looks to be, if he's sticking around on this team, he looks like he might that might be his job there too. So if you do get any kind of bonuses for kick and punt returns or yardage, and you need a second, third flex, whatever, then Hines might be a way to go because you also get some running back value and some kick and punt return value. But they got a couple other guys that could return kicks and punts too. Moving on to the tight ends, we both mentioned him already, but Jack Doyle is their number one. And then they brought in Trey Burton this offseason too, which, I mean, either of them can be productive. As you mentioned already, Philip Rivers loves his tight ends. He pretty much went almost his whole career with Antonio Gates. He's had Hunter Henry for a couple of years. Virgil Green or Ladarius Green, he's had. He's even made him look good at some points. But Trey Burton, we've seen him be good before. Jack Doyle, he's as solid as they come. So they're both flyer streamer options. I mean, Doyle you're probably getting later in drafts. Trey Burton is not being drafted at all, and for good reason. I mean, it's Doyle's not really an injury prone guy. He has missed some games, especially the year when Eric Ebron was there. He missed about half the season, and then he came back, and it was kind of like a 1A, 1B. But Trey Burton could get a lot of value if Doyle were to go down. But they are, like, if you're in a tight end premium league, or if you're in a league where you need to start two tight ends, I've seen a couple of those floating around recently. Burton could be a guy that you might start in one of those slots, just taking a flyer on him, or as a bye week fill-in.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of sleeper articles on Jack Doyle, and I'm just not on the same page as everybody else, I guess. I mean, number one, this is a two tight end offense. And I guess going back to Paris Campbell playing in the slot, he won't have as many opportunities. Because when you think about the Philadelphia Eagles and how Doug Peterson runs his offense, this is a very similar system. So I do think that Trey Burton and Jack Doyle are both going to be involved. So that's kind of number one for me. In general, I do think Doyle will have some touchdowns, but one of the most concerning things for me is when you look at when Jack Doyle was on the field, he had the 22nd highest route participation, which that sounds like a weird concept, but essentially among all tight ends in the NFL, he was only running the 22nd most routes. So what that says to me is he actually stayed in a lot because he's actually a really solid blocker as well. So he's not a guy that's always necessarily on the field running routes. He is a valued blocker, and I think he's going to be used in that capacity. On the opposite end, Trey Burton is a terrible blocker, and he's been known as more of a pass catch. I mean, he only really had one good season with the Bears, but he's been known as more of a pass catching threat. So I do think Burton can be used a little bit. I'll give Jack Doyle a small bump because of Phillip Rivers. But overall, I've seen people say Jack Doyle's a top 10 tight end this year. You're just way overvaluing what Phillip Rivers is going to bring to this offense at 37 years old. I mean, Jack Doyle averaged the 21st most points per game last season. I think he finished, I want to say, tight end 15 last year. But really, that was because he stayed healthy. Some of the guys ahead of him were injured, so naturally he played more games and moved ahead of them. But when you look at it on a per game basis, only 21st. So Jack Doyle, too, when you think about it, I like my high upside tight ends. You know how much I like Mike Gesicki and those athletic tight ends, and that's just not Jack Doyle. He is more of an old school, gets you 5 or 6 touchdowns. He stays in, he blocks, and he's not like these diva tight ends now.
No, but if you need a tight end to throw it to Philip Rivers for a touchdown, Trey Burton's your guy.
Yeah.
Just to bit into the kicker real quick. They got looks like it's going to be a little bit of a battle. They got Chase McLaughlin there, but they did bring in Rodrigo Blankenship in the as an undrafted free agent. It's a
Yeah, they just
dome. They play in a dome within a lot of their games. Houston has a dome as well. Jacksonville obviously is in Florida, and then Tennessee is in a warmer state too. So at least 11 of his games are in a dome or warm weather, and then I don't know where the other 5 are, but so whatever whatever kicker ends up winning this job with the offense that they have, and they got a solid defense. We'll talk a little bit about them too, but the offense that they have, they're going to be able to move the ball. You're going to get some opportunities from the kicker. So if you need a kicker, obviously we don't like the draft kickers, but if you're looking for one week one and just a stream, then find out which one of these kickers is going to end up starting, and then maybe scoop him up because he has a lot of favorable weather games.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's not many other notes. I will say that I think Blankenship's going to win the job. I'm a little biased. He was Georgia's kicker last year, and he was actually the #1 kicker coming into the draft, and he kind of surprisingly went undrafted. So, I mean, he's actually a pretty talented kicker. He had the longest field goal in Rose Bowl history. I just remember that from watching it, but he yeah, I mean, they have a solid offense, good weather conditions. The only reason I wouldn't be drafting either one of these guys is just they're very unknown at this point. You can get guys in good weather stadiums that are more known commodities, and there's really no chance to waste a good pick on an unknown kicker.
Yeah, for sure. But favorable matchups, Jacksonville. If you need to play a kicker against them, and then you got those to choose from. Getting into their defense and their IDPs, they got a handful of names that you might grab in IDPs. You can't go without saying Darius Leonard. Came out the same year as Quentin Nelson. They had an excellent draft that year. They drafted Quentin Nelson in the first round, and then they took Darius Leonard in the second round. Both on the offensive and defensive side of the ball, they just ran away with that draft. But Darius Leonard, he's one of the best young linebackers in the league. He follows. He could get to the ball carrier. He's good as far as pass defense goes. He's got a couple interceptions under his belt. He is the #1 IDP on this team, and he's arguably a top 10 IDP in the league as long as he's healthy. I know he missed a lot of time last year. Justin Houston is another one that they got playing from the edge role. I don't like playing a lot of linemen, but playing the edge, he could get to the quarterback, so that's one where you could get sacks and get tackles. They traded for DeForest Buckner in the draft, which is why they didn't have a first-round pick this year. That was technically their first-round pick. But again, he's on the line. He's more of a run stuffer. I don't know if he's going to get you a lot of fantasy points from a fantasy perspective, but he is going to help out that defense as a whole. Xavier Rhodes, they picked up in free agency from Minnesota. He's a cornerback who's probably going to be following a lot of the other teams' #1s. So it's not really shut down. I mean, I think his days of being a shutdown cornerback from Minnesota are behind him. But he might get some opportunity for some stats because of the fact that he's following those #1 guys. So Minshew throwing at Chark or Watson throwing at Fuller, he might have a chance at getting those tackles or interceptions or pass breakups if you play with those kind of stats. So, like I said in previous episodes, I hate taking cornerbacks, but he's one that I might consider because of that. He's not really shut down. You're not getting somebody that's just going to be avoided. You're getting a guy that, okay, he's thrown in that direction. It's a name that I might want. And then Malik Hooker is one of their safeties. He's another one that he has an opportunity for more tackles being back there because he's in the safety role.
Yeah, so I'll do my quick defensive depth chart scan here. So we're looking for sacks on the defensive line. You already mentioned Justin Houston has been pretty consistent throughout the course of his career. He had 11 sacks last year, and he's a solid. If you have to start a specific defensive lineman, he's a solid, I'd say, second defensive line. I'm in a lot of leagues that start a lot of IDPs, so if you're looking for a second defensive lineman, I would say Justin Houston is pretty solid. DeForest Buckner is one of those guys that's a better real life nose tackle than a fantasy asset, and I always see him overdrafted because people are like, oh man, he just got traded for a first round pick. DeForest Buckner is good, and that's not to say he's bad because he had 7.5 sacks last year and 11 the year before, which is impressive from a nose tackle. But even still, he was outside the top 20 for defensive lineman IDP. So, he's better real life player than a fantasy asset. You already mentioned Darius Leonard. There's not much to say there. I've done 8 drafts, I believe, now with IDPs in them, and Darius Leonard's been the first IDP off the board in every single one. So he's really everyone's consensus number one, and for good reason. And when you're looking at the rest of their linebacking core, you're looking for more tackles here. A lot of question marks here. Darius Leonard is their weak side linebacker. Their starting middle linebacker, who is usually your team leader in tackles, is Anthony Walker. He had 124 tackles last season. Once again, I mentioned this before. He's not really being drafted. I think he's a perfect guy to put on your watch list, see how many tackles he gets early in the season, and kind of take it from there. Same with they have Kahari Willis as their safety. He had 72 tackles last year, and that was only in 14 games played, and he only started 9 of them. So if he's their starting safety most of the season, he could be an underdog candidate to get you 100 tackles at the strong safety position. There are other linebackers. I don't know much about Bobby Okurik. He, from what I've read, he's more of a rotational player, so I wouldn't count on him starting the whole year. But once again, you just got to monitor early in the season who's accumulating the most tackles and kind of take it from there. If you work the waiver wire in IDP leagues, you can find a lot of value.
All right, so that's the Indianapolis Colts breakdown. Last year they finished 7-9, third in the division, the AFC South. I think that division is a little bit more wide open. Not to say that DeAndre Hopkins was the whole division, but Watson losing his favorite target, his top weapon, and not really bringing anything too much back in return. They brought David Johnson back, but it kind of opens up the division for, I think it's going to be a 3-team race. The Titans, they ended up making the playoffs last year and actually made it to the AFC Championship game, but there's still some question marks about them. The Colts now, I mean, Philip Rivers, I think, elevates them, and just that offensive line, if they can get a run game together, and if they can protect Philip Rivers, I think that he can make a run in the playoffs. And then obviously we talked about the Texans, who did win the division last year. I mean, you can't count out Watson, you can't count them out, but I think it's going to be a little bit more wide open. I could see all 3 of these teams being like 9-7 and just having it come down to a tiebreaker at the end of the year for who wins the division, and maybe one of them takes the 7th wild card.
Yeah, I actually have the Colts winning the division. I do agree with you. I think it's going to be very close. For me, when you look at the entire roster, I think the Colts have the most talented roster as a whole. Number 1 offensive line. We just talked about their defense, who they added to DeForest Buckner, who's a Pro Bowler, with Justin Houston. Some of those young linebackers, arguably the best linebacker in the NFL right now. They added a few secondary pieces. Philip Rivers actually kind of makes me nervous because I think this is the kind of team that just needs a guy that's not going to lose them games. And I think at this point in his career, Philip Rivers can lose you a lot of games based on his style of play. But overall, I do think the Colts have the most talented roster, and they'll definitely be in contention to win the division.
All right, so until the next episode, until the next mini-series, we'll see you then.